Yeah, I know.
It looks beautiful.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. It's just past 3:30, I think, 3:32, so we'll get ourselves started this afternoon. So first, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we meet is the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and as all of us know in Winnipeg, this is Treaty 1 land and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I'm Peter Miller. I think almost everyone knows that as well, but I'll introduce myself for the umpteenth time. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Classics, and along with my co-organizer, Ruth Dickinson, who can't be here today, we're the organizers of New Directions in Classics, and we'd like to welcome you to our fourth lecture. This is the Department of Classics' new, at least as of last year, public lecture series. Our thanks are owed to the University of Winnipeg Classics Student Association for the all-important coffee and tea, the Department of Classics for moral and financial support, and the University of Winnipeg Marketing and Communications Department for the excellent posters that hopefully brought some of you here today. Today's talk in particular, as the slide on the screen tells you, has been supported through donations to the Department of Classics Future Fund. So I implore you, if you're here today and you enjoy this lecture, if you've been to any of our other lectures and have enjoyed them, to please help us keep bringing in speakers from around Canada. The Department of Classics does not have an independent permanent fund for visiting speakers, and all of these talks are possible thanks to donations, cooperation with other departments, or the generosity of the visiting speakers and their departments at their home institutions. So we'd love to be able to contribute a little as well. If you're interested in making a one-time or ongoing donation, surprise, surprise, I can help you. So talk to me afterwards. We can set that up. It's a cliche, I know, but it doesn't take a lot. $5 a month, $2 a month, $3 a month, right? This is can make a huge difference for us. As always, if you want to hear more about our lecture series, you can be added to my sometimes occasional email list, I guess. If you're not on it, if you'd like a poster with the remainder of this year's talks on them, I have some available. All of our events are advertised on Facebook and on Twitter, and that's at the bottom of this slide as well. We are inspired to invite today's speaker, one of the world's experts on beer and antiquity, by Dr. Matt Gibbs' partnership with Barnhammer Brewing, and I thank the Barnhammer crew, or there's a few there, right, for coming out again. Dr. Gibbs' project, along with Barnhammer staff, has brewed Zosimus's Roman Egyptian beer and Columella's Roman mead. If you were a University of Winnipeg alumni last year, you've already tasted this and know how good it is. In any case, if just hearing about ancient beer isn't enough and you want to engage the rest of your senses in the exploration of antiquity, immediately after today's talk at 5:30 p.m. at Barnhammer's Tap Room at 595 Wall Street, that's Wall and Portage, a 20 or 30-minute walk from here, depending on how eager you are for ancient beer and mead. We'll be hosting an informal sampling session. So everyone here is welcome to attend. Please just come and see me after the talk to give me your name, just so we can keep track of the numbers. I see some nervous. Oh, is there? No? Okay. I saw some nervous glances, I thought. Yeah, but anyway. You're all welcome to come and taste the beer. It was, I think, just finished off yesterday or the day before, right? So it's a brand new bottling, or whatever we call it. So you're welcome to come. And the good news, of course, is that once you've tasted Zosimus's wonderful beer, you will be at one of the leading craft brewers in Winnipeg, right, where you can have some actually good beer that's on tap, like, for example, the new Backstabbing Brutus, which, despite discussions on Twitter, I think has to have been influenced by classics. It's in your brains now, guys. That's the problem. So that's available. With that said, it's my great pleasure then to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Max Nelson, who earned his BA in Classical Civilization at the University of Windsor, went on to complete an MA at the University of Ottawa and a PhD with the prestigious Killam Fellowship at the University of British Columbia. Since 2001, he's taught at the University of Windsor, where he's now an associate professor in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. His book, The Barbarian's Beverage, A History of Beer in Ancient Europe, was published by Routledge in 2005, and he's the editor of the first volume of the sixth-volume A Cultural History of Alcohol, to be published by Bloomsbury Press. Lest you think he's only interested in beer, however, he's a Renaissance man, because a recent article in Phoenix traces the reality or not of rude gestures with the finger amongst the ancient Greeks and Romans. It's our pleasure to have him here with a talk entitled The Tastes of Ancient Beer. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nelson.
Great, thanks so much, Peter, Matt, for the invitation and the hospitality. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for coming on a Friday afternoon. I really appreciate you being here. In Achilles Tatius' 2nd century AD novel, Leucippe and Clitophon, a shepherd is given a drink by a stranger, and he exclaims, "It's not the liquid that flows on the earth," that's water, "that produces but a slender pleasure as it slips down into the chest. This drink pleasures the nostrils even before it reaches the mouth. And though it is cold to the touch, it exhales a fiery pleasure from below when it bounds down to my belly." The stranger is none other than Dionysus. He responds, "This is the liquid of autumn." Of course, what they're talking about is wine. That's the beverage offered to the shepherd. Similar ecstatic descriptions of beer are hard to find in ancient sources, particularly Greco-Roman sources. We can go back to a Sumerian source if we want, right? The famous hymn to the goddess Ninkasi from 1800 BC. There, the beer goddess Ninkasi is not so much praised as her process of making sweet-smelling beer. And so this is one of the few kind of praises we have, at least in part, of beer from ancient times. In Greco-Roman sources, negative descriptions of beer are more common. The Emperor Julian, for instance, wrote an epigram on wine made from barley. "Who and from where are you, Dionysus? Since by the true Bacchus I don't recognize you, I know only the son of Zeus. While he smells like nectar, you smell like a billy goat." Or spelt. There is a pun here. The Greek says tragos, which can be either. Can it be then, spelt being a cereal, right? Can it be then that the Celts, because of a lack of grapes, made you from cereals? Therefore, one should call you Demetrius, born of Demeter, or it can mean born of two mothers, not Dionysus, rather wheat-born than fire-born, and Bromus, oats, not Bromius, roar, and so on. So Julian is having fun here. The poem is playful and relies on a number of puns, but also shows a basic distaste, obviously, for beer. Today, I want to go beyond such obviously biased testimonies to discuss what we can know of the tastes of ancient beers. While no beers from antiquity survive for us to sample, we can begin to reconstruct how they tasted by studying the results of new methods of chemically analyzing ancient containers, which once contained beer, for traces of Beerstone, which is calcium oxalate or starch, by carefully examining the extant written evidence and also by observing various old brewing techniques still in use today, or at least well attested in modern times. Each of these types of evidence poses its own challenges. For instance, most references tend to be very brief, but some general conclusions can certainly be confidently made. Overall, most ancient beers were no doubt quite different from those we enjoy today. Before getting to the taste of ancient beers, it'll be useful, I think, to turn to the earliest evidence for alcohol and, first to talk about what beer is and how it's made, focusing on fermentation. Then I'll turn to the earliest evidence for alcohol in beer, which comes from material finds. And then I will talk about beer in the world of the Greeks and Romans before turning finally to the tastes of ancient beers. So let's talk first about fermentation. And I should say I am no brewer or chemist, and this is just a very simplistic way of showing how fermentation works, right? Alcoholic drink fermentation requires a number of ingredients and processes to operate, right? You need water, sugar, and yeast, and with the proper temperature, lack of oxygen, you can get ethyl alcohol, carbon dioxide, and the various other residues, esters and acids, and so forth. To put it extremely crudely, you have a little organism, yeast, that swims around in water, that eats up sugar, and in the right condition, pees out alcohol farts out bubbles, and then you drink it up. So again, I'm no brewer or chemist, but that's the easiest way of thinking about it. Beer production requires a step not found in other forms of alcoholic drink fermentation, like wine made from fruits, and that's because cereal doesn't contain on its own many fermentable sugars, and so the cereal grain has to be processed to gather more sugar from it, and that's done through enzymatic action. You use enzymes. In ancient times, this would have been done, very early on using wild cereals, even before the advent of agriculture, by germinating those cereals, which is still what is done today. The process of malting is getting the cereals to sprout, and then ending the sprouting, and just through that sprouting you'll have some sugars that you can work with. However, it's also been found that just masticating the cereal, that is chewing it, can also make it fermentable, because there are enzymes in the saliva that can break down the cereal as well. So in modern brewing, there are all kinds of other steps, mashing and lautering and so forth, but in the earliest process of beer fermentation, you just needed some wild cereal, and you needed to convert that somehow, right, through germination or mastication, to produce maltose, the sugar that then the wild yeast found potentially in the air, or at least around where you're making the beer, to convert that maltose in water to your alcohol. On top of that, various additives could be introduced as well, and we'll look at those as we go. Now, our earliest evidence for alcoholic beverages shows, in fact, that people pretty much fermented whatever they had available, right? So whatever you could get around you, right, depending on the season and the climate and so on, and get it to make you intoxicated, that's what you would use, and often in combination, right? So the sugar that you use can come from various sources: fruit, sap, honey, milk, and cereals, as we saw. And often these were combined together, as our earliest archaeological evidence shows. Now, using fruit would have been some of the easiest, because fruit on its own, like a grape, has yeast on its skin and it already has water in it. All it needs is to be crushed and left, and you pretty much have wine, not very good wine. Whereas again, with beer, you need that extra step. So presumably, fruit fermentation would have occurred before some of these other ones. But again, often any kind of fermentable would be mixed together. And our earliest known evidence for alcohol, at least as of now, comes from China, right? A number of jars have been found to contain a beverage that seems to have had rice, so that's the cereal basis, right? Honey and hawthorn fruit and or grapes. So this would be a beer / mead / wine, and it dates to roughly 7,000 to 6,000 BC in China, as I said. Similar finds have been found in various other places, again showing that people tended to ferment whatever could be fermented, and altogether without the kind of strict style guidelines that might have appeared later, right? This drink, among others, has been tentatively recreated through so-called experimental archaeology, a speculative though interesting means of learning about ancient drinks, as we know, right? In his 2017 book, Ancient Brews, Rediscovered and Recreated, the scientist who discovered this, Dr. Patrick McGovern, talks about these various recreations he's made with the Dogfish Head Brewery in Delaware, right? They made a version of this Chinese mixed fermentation beverage. In his work, he defends such recreations and notes in detail their shortcomings, since often all we have are some ingredients that we know of that were used in any specific beverage. We don't know what yeasts and bacteria were present during fermentation, nor I should say the quantities of the ingredients in the beverage. All those things are not recoverable, right? So all he knew was that there was some honey, some grapes, or maybe some other fruit, some rice, and that is only a very bare first step towards recreating a drink, right? So I won't talk further about recreating beers, right? You know, the Barn Hammer people know all about it, and we'll learn about it later, and Matt Gibbs already gave a talk earlier this semester about that. So I'll leave that topic for now. In any case, as I said, these mixed fermentables are found in various other places, including in Europe, where various cereals, fruits, and honey in combination were made into a drink. So for instance, cereal and honey have been found dating back to 3000 BC in this site in Scotland. There have also been similar findings in Denmark. And there are continuously, it's hard to keep up with all the new finds which are continuously being reported and so on. In any case, when we come to beer itself, let's just say plain beer, right? Our first evidence comes from around 3000 BC, that is just fermented cereal. Sorry, here's one more evidence of this kind of mixed fermented beverage, this one from Denmark. A birch bark container with traces of lime, meadowsweet, and white clover pollen, showing there was honey in it, wheat grains, as well as bog myrtle, cowberry, and cranberry, found in a grave of a young woman in Denmark. So this, again, shows this kind of beverage in which honey, grapes, and cereals are all fermented together. And this tradition died out in Europe by the time of the Iron Age, around 1000 BC, except in some basic combinations like cereals and honey, as we'll talk about, except in Scandinavia, where it continued into the Middle Ages. They continued to ferment cereals with various fruits and so forth. When we're talking about, again, plain beer, if we want to call it that, right, our earliest evidence comes from around 3000 BC at a number of sites. There have been reports in Turkey and China. This is at least one of the earliest pieces of evidence for beer residue, calcium oxalate or beerstone, found on a sherd in Arran. And right around the same time, we have evidence for beer in Europe as well, and also in writing, I should say. We have a tablet from Iraq with one of the earliest known examples of writing in the world, and there beer is listed as a ration for workers. And in Europe, we also have traces of barley beer by about 3000 BC as well. So it seems that during the Iron Age, from roughly, again, 1000 BC on, the production of indiscriminately mixed fermented drinks began to wane, except in the far north. And there came to be more kind of strict styles of fermented drinks that were made. Just grape wine, right, fermented in some places, cereals in others, so forth. However, it's wrong to think that at this stage, beer was Northern European and wine was Southern European. Many people have made that distinction. This is just one example, right, that you had a beer drinking zone in the north, a wine drinking zone in the south, and a beer and wine drinking zone in the middle. And it's a stereotype we still have today, right? We connect wine drinking to Italy, and we connect beer drinking to Germany, for instance. So this is a well-ingrained kind of stereotype. But it's worth pointing out that it's neither accurate for today nor for antiquity. As for today, beer drinking has been on the increase while wine drinking has been on the decrease in Southern and Eastern Europe as a whole, while beer drinking has been on the decrease in Northern and Central Europe, leading, it would seem, to a kind of homogenization of European drinking traditions. And beer, in fact, is quite popular today in Southern Europe. There's been a veritable craft brewing revolution in Italy. In Spain, the most consumed alcoholic beverage is beer. In Sweden, the most consumed alcoholic beverage is wine. When we look back at ancient times, similarly, there is evidence for beer drinking pretty much all over Europe, including in what is now Portugal, Spain, southern France, northern Italy, and parts of Greece. However, what we find is a real lack of beer here, right? In mainland Italy or mainland Greece, at least from the classical period onward. It's not attested in any written sources, nor have we found archaeological evidence. And I'll turn to that in a second. So rather than a northern-southern dichotomy, right, of beer versus wine, I rather suggest that more important was an east-west dichotomy in ancient Europe. As this shows, barley was used for beer throughout Europe in those places where they made beer. And you can see that, right, the barley here with the stripes. So that was found pretty much everywhere where they made beer. They used barley. Barley is a very hardy cereal that's easy to grow and easy to malt, and it's still the primary cereal used for beer making today. However, what we find, interestingly, is that wheat beer was only made in the West, and millet beer was only made in the East. And so here we have an interesting distinction. For some reason, everyone used barley as their main cereal to make beer, but in the West, the favored secondary cereal was wheat, and in the East, it was millet. So beer then was common among practically all ancient societies which grew cereals, but oddly again was not found among classical Greeks on the mainland or the Romans in Italy. And this puzzle is at the root of my book, The Barbarian's Beverage. The original reason for this remains rather mysterious. The Greeks and Romans had lots of cereal and had plenty of opportunity to make beer, but they didn't, like most cereal growing places. Over time, the very fact that beer was the drink of others was probably enough to condemn it, and various pseudoscientific theories eventually were used to justify this condemnation, as we'll see. Now, it is too simplistic to say that all Greeks and Romans disliked the drink, since those who tried it sometimes found it okay, like Xenophon when he was traveling through Armenia. Of course, Romans eventually amalgamated many beer drinkers into their empire, and the Emperor Valens was infamous as a beer drinker, for example. However, distaste for the beverage among classical sources is common, and it's first explicitly found in Aeschylus, who mentions beer as effeminate and enfeebling. So in his Suppliant Women, he has King Pelasgus say, "Truly you Egyptians," right, you Egyptians, "will find that the dwellers of this land are men, not drinkers of the inebriant made from barley." And in a fragment of his play Lycurgus, "And after these things he drank Brutos," that kind of beer weakened by time, and he boasted haughtily, considered this to be courage, right, which obviously it's not. Now this contrasts obviously with our ideas of beer drinking, which I argue in my book come from Germanic tribes, right? While there are many Roman innovations that they could swallow, sorry the pun, one thing they couldn't is this idea that beer was effeminate, right? So still today we think of wine as classier than beer, but we certainly take on the Germanic notion of beer as a manly beverage rather than an effeminate, enfeebling one as we have here. Now, the second quote is from Aeschylus's play Lycurgus, and Lycurgus in myth was a king who was a beer drinker, right, and who was punished by Dionysus, the god of wine again, by having him chop down his own son, thinking that he was chopping down a vine branch, right? And so Lycurgus went mad for his betrayal of wine and the god Dionysus. In any case, the contrast between beer and wine was similarly made stark among the philosophers. Aristotle is the first to differentiate between wine and beer in our ancient sources, and he has some odd ideas about what made them different. Right? This is from his work on intoxication, which would be wonderful to have complete, but we don't. Right? It was his answer to Plato's symposium, which was on love. His symposium was on drunkenness. Only a few quotes from it survive, but he says, a peculiar thing happens in the case of the drink made of barley, the so-called pinon. Under the influence of all other intoxicants, those who become intoxicated fall in all directions, sometimes to the left or to the right, or onto their fronts or onto their backs. But those who become intoxicated from pinon, beer, only fall into their backs and lie flat. And another quote, those who become intoxicated from wine fall onto their faces. But those who have drunk the barley turn upside down on their heads because on the one hand, wine makes one heavy-headed, while on the other, the barley is stupefying. So you can see a lot of things going on here, right? But what's interesting is that, according to his observations at least, there are many different effects from wine and from beer. But what this shows us is that he didn't conceive of beer and wine being the same kind of beverage, right? And not all intoxicating substances were thought to be the same, right? Aristotle also talks about drugs too, that some of them are heavy-headed and so on. And it shows us that in ancient times, there was no concept of alcohol. In Greek or Latin, there is no word for alcohol, no concept that wine and beer are the same substance. As far as they understood, they were completely different substances. And wine had more in common with opium, which was also a heavy-headed substance, according to Aristotle, than it had with beer. Now, Aristotle's student Theophrastus considered beer as being the product of something which had decomposed. They even turn into drinkable juices, some products which they have caused to depart from their nature and have somewhat rotted, such as those who make wines from barley and wheat, and the so-called Zuthos beer in Egypt, right? So this is good, kind of drinkable stuff they have there, right? It's basically rotted cereal. So that was the explanation of how beer came about. Cereal was rotten. And we can start to understand then why Greeks thought badly of beer, right, as a decomposed substance. Other ancient authors also thought that beer was barley or wheat rotted in water, such as Dionysius of Halicarnassus and Tacitus. Greco-Roman medical authorities only began to discuss beer in the 1st century AD, by which time numerous peoples within the Roman Empire were beer drinkers. Often the negative effects were emphasized, though sometimes beneficial uses were in fact noted, particularly in recipes influenced by Egyptian or Celtic medical tradition. In the 1st century AD, the Hippocratic physician Rufus of Ephesus mentioned beer made with dates, an interesting piece of evidence for a mixed fermented beverage, as being bad for the stomach, while around the same time, Areteus of Cappadocia stated that beer, among other harsh substances, including Nile water, caused ulcerations on the tonsils. Both the reference to dates in Rufus and to Nile water in Areteus seems to point to Egyptian beer as their target. In the 1st century AD, the herbalist Dioscorides was the first to discuss the properties of 2 different types of beer. The first, Zuthos, a barley beer, probably from Egypt, was said to be diuretic, to act on the kidneys and sinews, to be especially harmful to the membranes, and to cause flatulence, bad humors, and even elephantiasis. The second type, Courmy, a barley or wheat beer, probably that of the Celts, was also said to be harmful to the sinews and bad for the humors, and it was added that it also caused headaches. Aside from the diuretic nature of beer and it causing flatulence and headaches, which we can probably attest to here, most of these claims are clearly false and presumably are not based on any sort of careful observation, but on a priori prejudice against a foreign beverage. Now, the 2nd century AD Galen marked an important stage in the ancient European medical understanding, or rather misunderstanding, of beer. He stated that it was because beer could arise out of a decomposed substance that it was bad for the humors and caused flatulence. He said, Zuthos is very pungent, made of barley, not with a little. It's bad for the humors, since it may arise from that which is rotten, and also causes flatulence. Some is pungent and warming, while the rest is cold, watery, and sour. And later he says, yeast partakes of sharp, cold, and putrefactive heat. Galen here is the first to connect two separate notions about beer found in ancient Greek authors. And in fact, he makes them causally related. That beer was due to decomposition, right? First found in Theophrastus. He talks about that here. It's bad for the humors because it comes from what is rotten, right? And he combines that with the idea that it was bad for the humors and caused flatulence, first found in Dioscorides. And he further explained precisely how it was that beer was a decomposed substance and how it was that it was bad for the humors in a very terse way, right? He explained that decomposition was caused by yeast, saying that yeast has putrefactive heat. While it is now known that any alcoholic fermentation is due to yeast, as I showed you, in antiquity, not only was there no conception of alcohol, right? Wine and beer could be distinguished, as we saw, as different sets of substances, as Aristotle had done, but not all intoxicating drinks were thought to be affected by yeast. In this case, yeast was thought to have a deleterious effect on the cereals, because Galen was happy to think of cereal beverages or soups that were not fermented as healthful. So porridge is fine, but once you add yeast to that, you're putrefying it, and that causes it to go bad and hurt your humors. It's often thought that the discovery that beer is made with yeast is modern, but that's not at all the case, right? In ancient times, they understood what yeast was, obviously in bread making. They had both leavened and unleavened bread. And there was this understanding that yeast was used in beer. However, it was usually thought that wine was not used, did not need yeast. There was one type of wine in ancient times which they said was leavened wine, but the idea was that most wine just kind of almost magically, if you want, comes from grapes. And it's this, I think, that's essential in this misunderstanding about alcohol in ancient times, right? Thinking that cereal becomes intoxicated when it's rotted by yeast, wine becomes intoxicated, but without any of the bad effect of yeast. And so that led to a whole slew of ideas about beer being bad for the body. Now, Galen also here speaks of beer as watery and cold, and here he's connecting it to the humoral theory, in which various comestibles were considered either cold or hot, or dry or wet. So everything was thought to partake in these qualities, right? Aristotle first talks about these, but Galen built up a whole system of them. Every single food, and also every animal and person and thing, partakes in either the cold or hot or wet or dry. And this has nothing to do with whether something is actually hot to the touch or wet like a drink, right? It's some kind of essential quality they have that goes beyond that. But in this thinking, beer was thought to be cold and wet, whereas wine was thought of as hot and dry. Again, completely different substances that had basic, different fundamental qualities and affected people differently. And in this kind of thinking, women were connected with the cold and wet, and men with the hot and dry. And that can explain, or at least justify, why they thought that beer was an effeminate beverage. It's cold and wet, as women are. Wine is a great manly beverage because it's hot and dry, like men. So Galen provided a supposedly scientific explanation for why beer was an effeminate beverage, as Aeschylus had claimed long before, and also for why wine was better than beer, right? Wine does not partake in yeast, and wine has these hot and dry qualities. Now, Galen contrasts a type of barley beer which is pungent and warming with another which is cold, watery, and sour. And beers are regularly described in these two categories, that is, as either pungent or sour. And that leads us finally to thinking about the tastes of ancient beers, which is the main thing I want to talk about. Now, Michael McKinnon has pointed out that the taste of meat, for instance, in ancient times, or in his article on Taste of Meat, that taste is multidimensional and its assessment inherently complex. And indeed, beer taste is complicated and has been intensely studied in the last few decades. Flavor, sweet, bitter, sour, combines with aroma, floral, grainy, yeasty, and mouthfeel, fizzy, astringent, alkaline, as well as alcohol strength, weak, medium, strong, to provide our sensory appreciation of the drink. Now, basic beer made of malted cereals steeped in water and fermented with yeast will tend to be somewhat sweet from the maltose, which has not been fully attenuated or fully converted into alcohol. And already in ancient Europe, various bittering agents were added to beer, presumably mainly to balance out the flavor. Thus, evidence from Scotland dating back to the second millennium BC shows that Meadowsweet, which is a bittering agent despite its name, was used. Today, of course, the most common of these are hops, the fruitlets of a climbing plant which grows wild throughout mainland Europe, which are now almost universally found in beer, to adjust the flavor, sometimes quite radically, but also to help clarify and preserve the final product. Now, most accounts assume that beer hopping arose in the Middle Ages, particularly in brewing monasteries. But recently, there's been a find in a Celtic grave in northern Italy, in Pombia, dating to the 6th century BC, that contains an earthenware vessel with residue of barley and hops. It seems to be our first very good evidence for barley beer. If you have both barley and hops together in a vessel, what else can it be but beer, right? So this shows the possibility that hop beer is much more ancient than once thought. Arguably, the Gauls, who among others experimented with various herbal additives to beer, were making hop beer continuously since before the Roman takeover and then throughout the Roman period. Then Germanic tribes presumably adopted this innovation, and by the 9th century, Frankish monastic beer makers perpetuated this well-known and long-established native brewing method, which eventually gained widespread appeal. Furthermore, the process of brewing itself, that is of steeping herbs with the, just steeping the malt and possibly adding herbs and other additives, is first found in Europe among Celts. As you know from the recipe in Zosimus, the pseudo-Zosimus recipe, right? Which Matt discussed and the Barnhammer people have recreated. The method attested for making beer in the ancient Near East is to make fermented loaves loaves of malted cereal that are crumbled and fermented. And so actually the beer is not brewed, right? Our first evidence for beer actually being brewed comes from late antiquity, but refers back to the 2nd century BC at the siege of Numantia, when the Romans were taking over the last of the Celtiberians in the peninsula in 133 BC. The Numantians had been besieged in their town for months, had started to eat each other because there were no supplies, so cannibalism was rife. and they just decided just to get drunk on beer and just run out, and they say they got slaughtered, and that was the end of it. And so here's our source for it, but it mentions brewing, right? They all rushed suddenly from their 2 gates, having before made great use of a drink, which was not wine, of which this fertile land is deprived, but with the juice of wheat made through skill. Again, we often find these kind of circumlocutions to speak about beer, right, as a cereal wine, or here the juice of wheat, which juice they call kylia for being heated. In fact, the potency of the grain of the soaked fruit, that is cereal, is activated by this fire, and then it is dried, and after being reduced to a flour, so here's the process of malting explained, is mixed with soft juice. With this fermentation, a flavor of harshness and heat of intoxication is conferred. Therefore, warming themselves up again with this drink after a long famine, they presented themselves for war. So this is our first actual evidence for brewing, right? He talks about the beer being made heated, and he mentions the malting and so forth. So it's not extremely explicit, but we can argue that, again, it was the Celts who not only first used hops, it would seem, and potentially other herbs, but first steep them in beer through brewing, right? So beer that way is kind of made like a tea in which you add hops or other herbs to flavor it. In any case, this brings us to arguably the most notable difference between modern and ancient beers, the smokiness of those long ago. Since ancient Celtic beers at least would have been made over an open fire, as most food was cooked obviously in the ancient world, this would have imparted a certain smokiness. Some products like meat and cheese were more thoroughly smoked, not simply for reasons of taste, but for purposes of disinfection and preservation. Malts would have been often torrefied in hearths or kilns, and the beer itself fire brewed. Smoky beer is not mentioned in any ancient sources, but interestingly, smoked wine is attested in comic playwrights in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, although it might refer to the appearance of the wine, that it looks smoky. However, by Roman times, it's clear that some wines were smoked, such as the Falernian mentioned by Tibullus, or the Massalian wine ripened by smoke found in the poet Martial. Today, malt is usually simply dried with hot air, though a few types of malt are sometimes deliberately provided with a subtle smoky flavor. Strongly smoky beers are rare. Some notable smoked beers disappeared in the early 20th century, like the Grotzer made with smoked wheat in what is now Poland. The oldest commercially available smoked beers of today are the Rauch beers of Bamberg, Germany. These are made in only 2 breweries, Special, founded in 1536, and Schenkerla, founded in 1678. However, by the year 2000, nearly 50 American brewing companies were using smoked malts for certain styles of beers, especially Scotch ales, porters, and bocks. Modern experimentation has shown that there is no uniform smoky flavor, but that different woods and other fuels, such as straw or peat, impart quite diverse characteristics. The Bamberg beers are made with malts dried using smoke from a beechwood fire, while the Alaskan Brewing Company uses alder, and Brew Moon in Boston has used Hawaiian kiawe and applewood. Most modern accounts of the history of malting state that all ancient beers must have been dark because of the way malts were typically roasted over fires, and that only with a source like Coke, which is smokeless and easily controllable, was it possible to lighten beers. Now, no Greek or Roman author mentions the color of beer, though they do catalog various colors of wines. However, blonde and clear beers are very commonly attested in medieval texts. And we know that in medieval times they even appreciated beer in glassware as well. So we might want to rethink this idea that all ancient beers were necessarily cloudy and dark, that there may have been some control of malting to ensure lighter, clearer beers. Now, beer would have also had a tendency to sour. Beer would have been exposed to various bacteria while being made and also possibly when stored. The seeping in of oxygen in less than airtight containers would also have made the contents sour. As the technology to store and preserve beer has become better in the modern era, so could beer be better protected from souring bacteria. However, some brewers continue to produce purposely sour beers into the modern era, most notably in Belgium, Lambic from Brussels, or sour red or brown ales from Flanders. In Germany, Berliner Weiss, or the Goes of Goslar and Leipzig, which also has an unusual saltiness. Recently, especially in the United States, but also here in Canada and elsewhere, there's been a growing fad for the creation of sour beers, which tend to be drier and more acidic than the traditional European varieties. And in fact, what once would have been thrown out as having been gone bad, now is eagerly consumed, right, as a special sour beer. To counteract the common sourness of ancient beers, it would seem that sometimes they were sweetened, adding even to the sugariness of the malt. Theophrastus says that in Egypt, the leaves of the malanthale plant, whatever exactly that is, were added to the boil to make sweeter beer. Archaeological evidence shows that sweet gale, also known as bog myrtle, a coastal shrub which provides a sharp taste to beer, sometimes described as subtly sweet, but also as spicy and bittering, was used as early as the 5th century BC for beer in the area of the Rhine estuary, what is now the Netherlands. And by the Middle Ages, it was probably a predominant ingredient in the beer known as gruit. The most common sweetener for beer in ancient times, however, was surely honey, and we've talked a bit about evidence for honey beer. Honey was useful in many ways as an additive during the production of beer aside from sweetening it. It could increase the alcohol strength through its fermentable sugars. It could act as a preservative. It could provide yeast to help ferment the malted cereal, and potentially also add narcotic qualities from the flowers from the nectar of which the honey was made. In the 4th century BC, the Greek explorer Pytheas visited Northern Europe and wrote that among people there who had grain and honey, their beverage had these ingredients too, presumably meaning that they made beer and mead, and possibly honey beer. The passage is ambiguous on this point. In the 1st century BC, the Greek traveler Posidonius wrote that wealthy Gauls drank wine, the less rich drank wheat beer made with honey, and the masses drank plain beer, produced presumably with barley. Perhaps traditionally the wealthy Gauls drank mead rather than wine before it was introduced to them by southerners. And remains of Celtic mead and honey beer have been found in a number of sites in Germany and elsewhere. Now, the evidence in Posidonius also shows why Celts drank beer rather than, for instance, water, right? This was not for reasons of purity, as often stated, but of status. It's very common to say that people drank beer because water was polluted, particularly in the Middle Ages. But already going back to antiquity, 5th century BC, we have evidence that people knew to boil water to purify it, and this knowledge continues throughout the Middle Ages. And obviously it's much easier just to boil some water rather than go through the whole process of making beer if you want something that's pure. And so in fact we can find already in ancient times a hierarchy of beverages, right? If you can't afford anything else, you drink water. If you can't afford water, you might have some beer, right? At least among the Gauls. If you can afford a little better, it'll be beer with honey. If you can afford even more, it'll be mead or wine. And so these drinks become status symbols, right? And there's plenty of evidence for that as we go into the Middle Ages, and this is a little bit beyond our purview, but I'll just show you this one, which is interesting. It's from an abbot of a monastery, Lupus, from the 9th century AD. He says, "We want Fulcricus and Maris to return with the aforementioned brother, so that they may enjoy with us the perry," that is the drink made from fermented pears, "of which they are particularly fond, for this year scarcity of wine is feared. However, so that we should declare the truth, a shortage of fruits threatens this," that is the perry, And truly, a barren production of cereals threatens beer. Therefore, we will all use a safe, natural drink, by means of which the health of the soul and body is often acquired, not drawn from a muddy cistern, but from a clear well or the current of a glassy river. So he doesn't even say what that drink is, but it's water, right? And it clearly shows a hierarchy. Water is great. There's nothing wrong with water. It's not impure. But it actually is very good for the body and the soul. But water is just boring. It doesn't get you drunk, for one. Not that Lupus was thinking of drunkenness, maybe. But it's kind of an insipid beverage. So, instead of drinking water, you'll drink beer. But if you're out of beer, then you'll drink fermented pear juice. And if you're out of that, well, or I should put it the other way around, right? Sorry. If you can afford better than water, you'll drink beer. If you can afford better than beer, you'll drink fermented pear juice. And if you can afford better than that, you'll have wine. Right, so there comes to be a clear hierarchy by the Middle Ages, but detectable already in ancient times. Now, the Gauls then did a lot for ancient beers. Arguably, the beer we know today is really the product of what Celts did, right? They were the first to hop it. They were the first, as we know, to brew it, at least. There may have been others, but our evidence is there. They're the first to accept wine and beer at the same time, but order them in a hierarchy. And Gauls were also the first to make barrels, an ideal container for alcoholic beverages, as its use still today testifies an amazing technology that hasn't really changed in over 2,000 years. It is relatively, a barrel is relatively light, more so than a ceramic container, readily repairable by replacing staves or other pieces, easily transportable by rolling, and good for storage and aging. Barrels are first attested in literature and archaeologically in the 1st century BC. Strabo and Pliny both mention their use for wine, and they are known to have been used certainly for beer, but only by the Middle Ages. So in other words, all our earliest attestation is for wine being stored in barrels. Probably wine coming from Italy and other places that would be transferred from the heavy ceramic containers to barrels that could then be brought along on river boats and brought to various places within what is now France. Even though barrels aren't attested for beer in ancient times, it's likely that Gauls would have used them for beer as well. We know at least that the Gauls brewed on a large commercial scale. Again, many people say that this only began in the Middle Ages, but we have evidence for brewing guilds, if we want to call them that, right, or associations in Gaul. A number of tombstones show that both men and women were involved professionally in beer making, like this tombstone of Fortunatus of the beer making guild. So today, barrels are charred, providing a toasty flavor, sometimes described as spicy or vanilla-ish. Some are used for residual flavors from their previous uses, such as for bourbon. What started as a solution for transportation in ancient times became appreciated for something else, like taste. And similarly, we can see that with Retsina, right? A standard beverage in Greece today, which derives from the pine pitch used already in antiquity to help seal the storage jars. So what was done for purposes of convenience, right? Using wood to transport beer or pine pitch to seal jars has become something that people started to like for the taste and have replicated even outside of those ancient circumstances. There's one last thing that we should talk about, and that's the strength of ancient beers. There are few indications of exactly how strong ancient beers were. Xenophon, when he had that Armenian beer, which tasted okay once he got used to it, says it's very strong. Literally, he calls it unmixed, unless one pours in water. Diodorus Siculus wrote of barley beer in general that it was not much lacking in the good aroma and in the strength characteristic of wine. Now, scholars and amateurs alike have often confidently given the strength of ancient beers that it was 3% or 4% or 5 or 8. There's no way really to know, and partly this has to do with the fact we don't know exactly what yeasts were used in ancient times and so forth. However, I know of two sources long separate in time, which straddle the Greco-Roman period, which seem to indicate that typically beer was half the strength of wine. In the longest Egyptian medical papyrus that survives, the Ebers Papyrus, we have a treatment to help you defecate better, right? Take some chengeta fruit, whatever that is, some honey, and prepare it in one mass, then eat it, swallowing it with 10 row of beer or 5 row a measurement of wine. Now, it's not clear why you use twice as much beer as wine, but arguably it might be because of the alcohol strength. This becomes crystal clear over 2,000 years later, right? At the first synod of Aachen, when a universal rule for monks was established, that 1/2 pint of wine each day should be adequate for monks and should increase so as not to the point of intoxication as the rule states. So you can have 1/2 pint of wine, maybe a little more, as long as you don't get drunk. If wine is lacking, twice as much beer is to be provided. And here it's quite clear why you use twice as much beer. But the whole point is about intoxication, it's about the strength. 1/2 pint of wine should be enough. More, they might get drunk, but you can use twice as much beer. As far as I know, that's our first very good evidence for at least the relative alcoholic content of beer versus wine. And what's interesting that it pretty much fits with modern practice, right? By the 20th century, beer came to have a standard 5% alcohol by volume and wine 12%, roughly the same proportion here. And arguably because the types of yeasts that have been used in modern times are very similar to the ancient ones that could only ferment a beer up to about 5% normally, or a wine up to roughly double that amount. Now, in conclusion, beers today have a wide spectrum of taste profiles, not only due to the great variety of traditional styles, but also due to a contemporary interest in experimenting with ingredients and techniques. Around 160 beer styles are defined today. Thus, while coffee and chocolate notes have long been a characteristic of certain stouts or porters, for instance, peanut butter and whiskey flavors are something rather new. While no doubt there was a whole range of different tastes found in ancient beers, I would like to suggest that most were probably smoky and sour, and therefore not easily paralleled with any modern beers. Thank you very much.